In this episode, I would like to talk about an experience that I made, I think 6 or 7 years ago. And that was the Leicester Conference that is hosted by or conducted by the Tavistock Institute in London. And it's one of their signature, I would say, learning events, besides a couple of others that they're offering. But the Leicester Conference was something that I was very much intrigued with. And like I said, I would like to talk about it now, 6 or 7 years later, which is quite impressive from my point of view, because I usually don't talk about things I experienced 6 or 7 years ago, especially not those that are related to some kind of a learning endeavor that I did. So whenever I attended something at a university or somewhere else, a training course or something like that, usually someone or a course that is sitting with me for about 6 years, that's quite an impressive thing. And that's why I decided to talk about a little bit about the Leicester Conference, because it has been the worst and the best experience that I ever made in terms of learning something about myself, learning something about organizations, and learning something about the dynamics that can happen in a group. So why was it the worst experience ever? And usually people ask me that, and I don't know. I would say at the end I was emotionally sore. So I was so spent after 2 weeks that it was simply a horrifying experience for me. I also had the worst nightmare of my life during the Leicester Conference, at least as far as I can remember, the worst nightmare of my life. And I think after 3 days or 4 days of the 2 weeks conference, and I'm going to talk about what it is, at least in a nutshell. So after a couple of days, I went into my room. I had a single room. It is a residential conference. And I went into my bed, snuggled into my bed, put a blanket over my head and said, okay, there are two options. Either I'm going crazy or I will somehow figure it out. And based on what I can remember, maybe it's an illusion, I didn't sleep the whole night. So I turned from my left side to my right side. I started to sweat. And the next day I got out of bed and said, okay, I'm going to figure it out. So that was the worst experience of my life. And when from a psychological point of view, and maybe some would say it's good that this is the worst experience of my life, and there are even worse things that can happen. But at the same time, I would say it was the best experience of my life, at least in terms of learning something. And it has really been transformational for me. And that is something that I read when I signed up, or when I thought about it, thought about attending. And some people say it can be a life-changing event. I was laughing about that. I said, come on, how can a conference be a life-changing event? And I thought they're exaggerating. So it's kind of a sales pitch to say, okay, this can change your life, like many other people claim that this or that experience would probably change your life. And probably I was a bit arrogant, and I said they're using it as a marketing trick. And I suppose it wasn't a marketing trick, because it really was transformational for me. I changed a lot of my teaching, and I remember one situation when I was at the conference, and another participant, we were walking alongside to one of the conference rooms, and he said, so you are teaching change management? And I was looking at him and said, yes, I am. But honestly, I don't know how I was able to do that before having made this experience here. So that was pretty intense. And I did it. I went to the Leicester Conference because I stumbled over the theories of Tavistock, the Tavistock tradition, so to speak, during my PhD. I wrote my PhD about change management, and I had the idea to create a change process that is supporting the people who are affected by the change and involved in the change. So I wrote a lot about it, and I used the theories quite a bit. And I said, I'm pretty amazing because I know all the theory. So let's see how this thing might be in real life. And I applied, for the deep learning conference. At that time, they had a deep learning conference, and I said, "Come on, it's just, I don't know, $500 more. Let's go for the deep dive. Let's get everything out of it." By the way, which is an interesting learning. I seem to have a strong fear of missing out things, so I try to do everything at once, just not to miss something, which is one of the learnings probably that I took out of the conference, just one of them, and I will get back to my learnings in a couple of minutes. So I said, let's go for the deep learning conference. Let's get the real stuff going. And they said no. And I was like, okay, I'm paying for it. No problem. Let's sign me up for the deep learning conference. And they said no. And I replied very politely. I said, look, I did my PhD on that. I have a lot of experience, and I will be able to manage that. And they said, no. Usually, in more polite words, they asked me if I had any experience before that and so on. And I was quite convinced about myself. As I said, I did my PhD about that, so I must be extremely knowledgeable about that. And probably I was about the theories. And long story short, so I signed up only for the regular conference because they didn't let me sign up for the deep learning conference. And afterwards, honestly, I went to the lady who didn't sign me up and said, look, thank you very much that you didn't let me sign up for the deep learning conference, because the regular conference, that was enough. That was enough kind of a learning. So I will return one or the other year. I will return, and then maybe for the deep learning conference. But it was absolutely a good thing that they didn't sign me up for the more intense thing. So what is it? I'm talking about the Leicester Conference now for a couple of minutes, and I haven't said what it is. And I think it's important to say what it is or what it is not, as far as I remember that. Because I went to the Leicester Conference with the term conference in mind. And I attended numerous conferences before. You probably have done that yourself. So usually at a conference, you're greeted at a reception desk, and there is a schedule, and you can pick where to go and what to do. You meet and mingle with people and all these kind of things. And usually some people present some stuff, whatever they have done in academia or in practice. So they showcase best practices, failures, and something like that. So it's very structured, and you can basically go with the flow. You all know what a conference is. So, and with this thought in mind, I went to Leicester, the place where they are conducting the conference for decades now. And I think it was totally different. Totally different. Because, first of all, there are 2 residential weeks, and not maybe 2 days that a regular conference is. So it is 2 weeks of staying residentially on a campus or in a conference venue, depending on the year, probably when you go. So we were not on campus that year, but close by in Leicester. And these 2 weeks are so intense that I would say I literally lost the connection to something that I started to refer as the outer world. So there was the inner world of the conference and the outer world, so everything else. Because one idea is that they're creating an organization in the conference. So the conference will become an organization with members, with staff, and different roles. And I found this outer world at a certain point so stressful, and to stay connected to it, that I had a hard time to reply to my emails. So if I would make one suggestion, try to disconnect yourself definitely when you attend the conference, because at least for me, it was extremely stressful to stay connected, to reply to mails, and even talk to my wife, I would say. And I remember one of the conversations that we had, and I told her what is going on. And I told her, look, we are basically the whole day we're sitting in a circle, and we are talking about what this is, how we experience that, sitting in a circle and looking at each other. And she was silent and she said, okay, so this is what you're going to, this is why you are paying so much money, or this is what you pay so much money for? And I said, yes. And I think they're doing it for decades, so they know what they're doing. So there must be something in it. And I will get to the cost of the conference at a later point. So I really believed in them. And I would say I learned so much more than in any other learning event or during any other training events. And I attended a lot of them. And I would also say that the learning didn't happen right away. So I left, as I said, and I said, never again, forget it. And now, years later, I would say even 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later, I said, okay, that is definitely learning that has happened. And it was dramatically intense because, like I said, the Leicester Conference is basically, in my words, I would say it's the creation of an organization in a fast forward mode. So there are people, 70, 80 people plus minus, who meet for 2 weeks. And we, the people at the conference, the staff, and all the different roles are creating an organization in the fast forward mode. Everything seems to be amplified from my point of view. And there are different elements, like maybe that is the connection or a connection to a real conference. There is, for example, a plenary, which is basically a large room where people would meet. And this is where we would meet in the mornings, the first thing in the mornings. And I didn't like it. I hated it, honestly. Because I felt lost as an individual. That was something that I learned, and I will probably come back to that. So the plenary is something where you are crammed into a large room, and the whole conference is sitting there. And basically, it's like an open space. So it's 90 minutes, and at that time, that's it. So you would just sit there and see what's coming up in the group, and that I found that super confusing. And until now, I don't like these type of plenary things. I don't like large crowds. And as I said, because I feel lost as an individual, because I want to be seen as an individual, and I have a hard time, at least from my perception, to be seen in a large group. Which is interesting, by the way, and to connect that to the learning in the real world. If an organization is growing, people would probably experience the same. So if I would be in a very large organization, I would probably have a hard time to feel acknowledged, to feel being seen. And that is extremely interesting at the moment when I work with startups that are scaling very fast. So they're growing extremely fast. So I would say I see a lot of problems or see a lot of the feelings and emotions that come up when people are faced with a similar feeling or are pushed into a similar situation. So that helped me really a lot to understand what is going on in fast-growing, larger organizations. So that is the plenary, more or less. The small study group is something like the plenary, but much smaller. So it's a small study group. And basically, small study groups, sometimes they're called T groups, training groups, not at the Leicester Conference, but at least I experienced training groups as a very similar concept. So you are sitting in a circle of chairs with 10, 12 people and a consultant. And I thought the consultant is consulting me, which means telling me what to do and what best practices are and all these type of things. And obviously that didn't happen. So I will get back to that when I talk about one of my learnings. I had a fantasy about what their role is, and they didn't act according to my fantasy. So I was extremely frustrated. And the small study group was something that was in the beginning extremely difficult for me, but because I simply didn't know what do they want from me. It was so strange because usually I was used to getting a task. So let's say in this case, the consultant would tell me, do this and that, and then I would be in a very competitive mode and try to finish the task as well as possible. So I would say I was a pretty well-trained puppy, trying to serve the authorities and trying to fulfill every task that would be given to me in such a such an environment, and that didn't happen, which drove me crazy because I needed a task. So not having a task or thinking that I don't have a task in the small study group, that was very, very intense for me. And it took me a couple of days to understand what was really going on and what do they want from me and how am I able to work or function in an environment where I don't see any structure. And there is a lot of structure. I will get back to that during the conference. There is a lot of structure, actually. So we had the plenary, we had the small study group, and then we had some other tasks that were given to particular groups. So the groups were split and reconnected in some way. So we, for example, were doing something as a group for other groups or as a group for the plenary or something with another group, which led to a certain change in the dynamic, but to a very interesting dynamic. And that's too complex to reflect in such a brief podcast here. But that was quite interesting. And what I remember, because it was very soothing, it was very nice for me, were reflection sessions towards the end of the conference that helped me to make sense out of that. That were very, very nice sessions, because the consultant that we had there, he was we had a man doing that. He was really supportive from my point of view, because he was actually giving a lot of thoughts into the reflection process. So that was something like stepping aside and getting back to normal for me, because that was the type of work that I was used to do. So that's the conference in a very, very, very brief nutshell, in a very small nutshell. And there are certain elements that I haven't touched upon, but these are the ones that were for me, at least for me, very, very impressive. So what did I learn during the conference? There were so many learnings, as I said in the beginning. It's hard to talk about all of them. I think the first learning that I would describe as very impactful on me was that I realized how dependent I am on authorities. So when I arrived at the conference, usually I was used to getting a certain type of, let's say, service level by the provider of a conference or provider of an educational event. I used to spend a lot of times at some of the business schools in executive education programs. And usually when you arrive there, you have a designated check-in desk at a hotel. I don't know, someone is happily greeting you, and it is so amazing that you're there. You're getting, I don't know, whatever treats you can think of. It's a nice environment. You're being serviced all the time. And when I arrived at the Leicester Conference, honestly, I expected the same. So I arrived at the conference venue and wanted to check in. So I went to the check-in desk and I said, "Hello, here I am. My name is Jürgen." And they looked at me and said, "Last name." I said, "Okay, Radel." Then they browsed through their files, handed me a key and said, "She will bring you to your room." It's like, okay, no problem. And then there was a member of the staff bringing me to my room, and I started to chat about whatever, the weather, just trying to get in touch and make contact. By the way, which was another learning for me. Every time I'm nervous in a group, I start to cover that nervousness up with talking. So it's actually, I talk when I get nervous. So that was a realization, not right away, honestly, but I remembered that situation. So we walked to my room and I tried to get in touch with her and talk about what's going on. And she barely reacted. So it was yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. I was like, okay, she's not very kind of a talkative person. But I thought, okay, I met one strange person at the reception desk. I met another strange person, but there will be normal people here. So I checked in my room, and then I went to the large conference room. I tried to check out everything. And on the staircase, I met another member of the staff. And I said, "Hello, hey, how are you doing? Everything okay?" And he just walked by. not even noticing me. And I was furious about that. I was furious about it. I said, how impolite are those people? It's unbelievable. And then the session started, and it started in a way we were in the plenary again. And there was one line of the members of the staff. They were lined up along one side of the room, and all the participants were lined up across them. So it was like we were facing them in lines, and the room was, I mean, it was a big room, but it was too crowded from my point of view. And then they started to read a story from Alice in Wonderland, and I was like, okay, where did I end up here? What is that? That is really strange. Because I expected them to tell us, okay, this is the structure. We are so happy that you're here, and it's amazing, and we look forward to be working with you, and all these stuff that I was used to from conferences. But they didn't do that. So what they did was reading a paragraph of Alice in Wonderland, and then they introduced themselves. But they introduced themselves by just saying their name and pronouncing their name in a way that I found really awkward. So like they were looking straight at us, but at no one specifically, and they just pronounced their name like Jürgen Radel, and that was it. And then the next one, the next one, the next one, and then the conference director said, "Why are you here?" And I was furious. And because I expected them to tell me what to do and all these type of things, and asking me why I would be here. I mean, it's obvious why I'm here. I want to learn something. And I was so furious. And then, but obviously very polite, so I hold myself back and was just furious for myself. And then I started to look at the people around me like, how do they feel about that? Aren't they as furious as I am? I mean, that's ridiculous, obviously, what they're doing here. And then people would get up and would say, well, I'm here to discover this or that and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, these are interesting people. And at one point, I couldn't stand it anymore. And I stood up, looked at the staff and said, look, I'm here to learn something. But if I look at you and how you behave, I don't know if I can learn anything at all from you guys. And the way how you behave, I don't know if I even want to learn something from you. So I was furious. And then I sat down and said, oh, wow. I showed my balls. So I showed them, this is as far as you can get and no further. And they didn't react. And as you can imagine, that they didn't react even annoyed me even more. And I mean, that was like 3 hours into the conference. And I learned so much already. I learned that I was dependent on authorities. I learned that I arrive at an organization with a certain fantasy about how the organization should be and shouldn't be. And so many things. But at that point in time, obviously, I was so emotional that I couldn't reflect that. So that was very interesting. Learning to be dependent on authorities, who see me. I wanted them to react to me. I wanted them to acknowledge and see me. And that was a fundamental learning for me because let's say in the outer world, in the real life, outside of the conference, obviously I'm faced with authorities in many ways. And I realized that I am also dependent on how they see me. And I want them to acknowledge that I'm doing this or that great. So that is a way for an authority figure to motivate me, but also to manipulate me. And since I know that, I detached myself from that. So that was a fundamental, important experience for me. And there was another situation that was quite interesting as well. We were in small groups and we were working in small groups. And for whatever reason, our group decided to have a gatekeeper. So we didn't want to be interrupted by other groups. So every time someone would knock at the door and interrupt our work, we assigned a gatekeeper to go to the door and answer the door. Then ask the person in front of the door, what do you want from the group? Bring that back into the group, discuss it with the group, whether it would be okay to be interrupted or not, and then either admit the person or not. By the way, interestingly enough, the group was already interrupted, but talking about should we be interrupted or not, that was a strange thing. But anyway, so the door, someone knocked at the door and I went out and I said, okay, what do you want? And the person said, well, we want this and that. And can you do that? I said, yeah, no, we can't do that, or we can do that. So I made a reply, went back into the room, closed the door. And the group was looking at me and said, hey, what happened? And I told them. And they said, hey, but this is not what we have agreed upon. We have agreed that you would get out, ask what they're doing, then get back in again, negotiate that with us, and then we make a mutual decision. And I said, oh, yes, you are. That is correct. I'm sorry about that. I will never happen again. So another knock at the door. I went outside and there was the conference director. So the most important person of this conference in my mind, in my fantasy. So, and she was asking, okay, if you as a group were an animal, what kind of animal would you be? And I said, oh, that is a fascinating question. Let me think about that. And I spent some time thinking about that, discussing it with the director, and I would say we had a good time. And then I went back into the group, closed the door, and said, I'm back. No worries, everything's fine. I handled it. And the group said, I'm sorry, but that was not what we have agreed upon. And the last time you said it wouldn't happen again, but you did it again. I said, oh, you are right. And then I tried to rationalize that. I tried to explain them why it was important that I didn't want to interrupt them and blah, 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 blah. And they said, no. Why did you do that? That is your rationale speaking. And I realized that I wanted to keep the most powerful person of the conference for myself. I didn't want to share this person with the group, which was a tremendous, interesting learning experience for me to have that. And that led to a couple of discussions. And that was something that I would describe as a data point. So that is it's behavior, and that's data. And that's something, for example, that I struggled with in the small study group, creating data, which is behavior, and then analyze the behavior, but also with a perspective on the unconsciousness. That's the third learning that I will get back to after the second learning. So the first learning was how dependent I was on authorities and how I want to be seen by authorities and how I want to be connected by authorities. And authorities in the real world, leaders in organizations, powerful people, obviously. So having figured out that, it helped me to get detached from authorities. My second learning was, and I mentioned that a couple of times, that I arrive in organizations with a fantasy about the organization. I have an organization in my mind, but that is not necessarily the reality of the organization. So every time I go somewhere, I assign roles to people. And I want others to meet my role expectations, like the authorities of the conference. I wanted them to be like I was used to authorities to be, or like I was used to people in conferences to be. And they didn't act based on my expectations, which again made me furious. However, never made explicit what I was expecting from them. And they didn't react. In the small study group, I remember a situation where the consultant said something and I asked a question back and she didn't react. And I asked again and she didn't react. And again, I was getting annoyed because I don't want to use the word furious again. I got really annoyed. And I said, look, where I come from, people answer if you're getting asked. But she didn't even look at me, which was an interesting experience. And that was a data point for me that I got furious all the time, that I was annoyed all the time. That helped me to understand, why did I get annoyed? I mean, it's kind of a frustration. If you're getting frustrated, One way is to say that the others are idiots. The other idea is to think about, okay, why am I frustrated by this or that behavior, and what does it tell me about myself and not about the other person? So that was another tremendous learning experience. So whenever I do go into a new organization now, I absolutely know that I have fantasies in my mind and that they better not get into the way of understanding how the organization might be from the fantasies of other people who are involved in that. So that was my second learning. And the third learning for me that I would like to bring up was the unconscious. Working with the unconscious. We very often think that we see something, we rationalize it, but we never try to figure out what is the unconscious that is doing something to me. And that probably sounds a bit weird. And as I said, I struggled with that in several groups, in certain groups, like this dependency on authorities. That is something I would say that is unconscious. And it is something that I know, but I haven't thought about it. It's the unthought known. And the conference helped me to pull up a lot of stuff from the unthought known and to think about it and to discuss it with other participants in the conference, which was actually very helpful. So in the evenings, we would sit down somewhere with participants and I would tell them how crazy everything is and they would support me and vice versa. So that was extremely helpful. But in the beginning, like I said, I was wondering, what the hell do they want from me? What's going on here? And sometimes they said, look at the data. And I was like, what data? There is no data. And I was struggling with what I would consider as no structure. So there was basically no structure at the conference, but that's not true. There is a lot of structure, but I didn't see it at that time. And there are three elements: time, task, and territory. So for example, regarding the time, in the small study group, it would start on time, let's say at 9 o'clock in the morning or 9:30, and it would run for 90 minutes. And after 90 minutes, the consultant simply would get up and leave the room. And I found that annoying in the beginning, and after a while, I found that extremely helpful because it was kind of a structure that was very reliable in this chaos. So that helped me a lot. And the same is tasks. So for every session, for a small study group, there was a certain task, like in the plenary, for example, a question, why are you here? Even if I didn't understand the task, there was a task. I just couldn't see it. And the territory was to be in the room, to be in the circle, and to be just there in the here and now, which is another concept. So that crept more and more into my consciousness. And to give you one example about the unconsciousness, and I just mentioned one when I talked about that I wanted to keep the most powerful person in the conference for myself. The other, another example for my learning about how my unconscious is shaping my behaviors was a situation when we were in a room with a small group and we wanted to create a circle of chairs again. So I took the chairs and brought them into the middle, said, okay, we're done. This is the number of people. This is the number of chairs. We're good to go. And suddenly someone arrived from the group and she was a bit late and I didn't put a chair into the circle. And I said, oh, sorry, I forgot a chair. Let me grab one and put it into the circle. And one of the facilitators said, one of the consultants said, no. Why did you do that? And I said, what do you mean? Why didn't you put enough chairs in the circle? And I said, yeah, obviously, because I forgot to put one more chair in the circle. And he said, that is probably your consciousness telling you that this is the case, but what would your unconscious tell you? And I was thinking about that and I said, nothing. And he said, think twice. And I thought twice. And it was not very convenient for me. I was not too happy to talk about that in this situation because I was looking at the lady who entered the room late and for whom I didn't put a chair into the circle. And I said, look, I didn't put a chair into the circle because I wanted to exclude you. I didn't want you to be part of the group. And she said, that is interesting. It's a data point. Why did you do that? So why didn't you want me as a member of the group? And I said, because you are a very powerful woman. And I wanted to exclude you from the group because you would be the one who would be dangerous for me. So with you being present, my ability to lead this group would be limited. And then we had a very interesting conversation about that unconscious behavior. And again, that helped me a lot to think about, okay, what is my relationship to power? How do I deal in groups and do certain things? And I realized that I have a tendency that I want to lead groups. And even if I want to avoid that consciously, my unconsciousness seems to take over in a way. And again, I'm trying to lead the group. So you could say, wow, that's a natural born leader, so to speak, but that's not a very good thing in many cases. So I realized that I have certain powers, that I have certain things that I like to do and that I can do, but I also realized that every time I try to lead a group, I'm suppressing the group. So I have to pull all the weight, I have to do all the work for the group, which can be convenient for the group, by the way, but it's also quite draining. And I discovered, quite surprisingly, the less I do in a group, the more the group is doing. And surprisingly, ironically speaking, the results are pretty amazing. So I learned, take yourself back a little bit, let the group do its work, and both sides will probably benefit. So that was another example for unconscious learning. And in the beginning, I mentioned my issues in the plenary, in the large group. And that I felt lost in the large group. And unconsciously, I discovered fantastic ways to make myself being seen in the plenary by, for example, getting up, standing up, and grabbing something to drink. And there were these water dispensers. They were gurgling. So every time is gurgling the right word? I don't know. You are putting water into a cup, and there are large bubbles of air going up in these water dispensers, and that creates some kind of noise. So everybody was looking at me, and I was again present. Or I got up and went to the bathroom. To maybe that was some kind of a revolt against the authorities to show them, okay, I'm breaking the rule of the territory here, and you cannot do anything about it. And by doing that, I made myself visible in the plenary again. So that were fantastic learnings that I had. And when I returned, I remember the first group I was in after the Leicester Conference. The first group I was in, I suddenly thought, okay, now I see everything colorized. I suddenly have developed senses that weren't there before. That was absolutely fascinating for me to return to groups after the Leicester Conference. But honestly, I was happy that I didn't do that right away, because I went on vacation for 2 weeks, not intentionally, but planned. But not because I thought, okay, this is going to be so stressful. It was just, it happened. Because at the end, I felt emotionally so sore and spent. I said, never again. I remember a situation. I was getting back from Leicester to London in the train, and I tried to put my suitcase into a compartment in the train. So I tried to push it in, and it didn't work. I turned it, I pushed it, and it didn't work. So I turned it again, I pushed harder, it didn't work. And I realized that the whole coach, the people who were sitting in the train, they were looking at me, and I started to sweat, and I was trying to get the suitcase into that compartment. And suddenly the guy from the railroad company stood beside me, put his hand onto my shoulder, looked at me and said, "Hey, just turn it." And I turned the suitcase, and it slided into the compartment. And I said, "Okay, thank you. I think I need vacation." And that is what I did. And like I said, my wife said, "It's so much money. Why did you spend so much money to get so frustrated?" And honestly, I think I have a different relation to being frustrated now, because frustration is something that is indicating that there is something interesting to learn about myself most of the time. And obviously, it all depends on your financial situation, if it's a lot of money or not, and on the perspective that you have. But I myself, I have experienced several business schools, like I said, and leadership trainings. I don't know how many. And they all have their price, I would say. And looking back several years now of experience in executive education, I would say decades of experience with education and executive education, I would say that the Leicester Conference is absolutely one of the best value for money events, and that it had the most impact on my personal learning in the area of organization and leadership and change. Obviously, if this is the area you're in, that is an absolutely, I would say, a must see, something that you have to do. I would even say that at a certain leadership position, if you're not familiar, and I'm not saying you have to do the Leicester Conference, but I'm saying group relations or group dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, not doing that, from my point of view, would be that you are missing an absolutely important piece of the puzzle of your work. So whenever you are in a leadership position or you have to deal with people in a more or less complex environment, I would say consider doing something in the field of group relations. Be aware of what you're doing. Like I said, it can be transformational, it can be very stressful, but definitely not doing it, for me, is not an option. And that was my perspective on the Leicester Conference years later, and I still realize how excited I am and how vivid the impressions of the conference still are when I talk about them. And again, that is surprising for me, because that usually doesn't happen if you attend a 2-day training where you get quote unquote repaired regarding your leadership style or learn something about change and all these things. So that was a very impressive thing to do. And I'm excited to hear or read from you guys if you ever attend or plan to attend a Leicester Conference.